Hi there, welcome to TVI Tips from Amanda. This video is specifically designed for classroom teachers, whether you are a content teacher or a grade level teacher or even a special or resource teacher. And for those of you who have students in your classroom who are blind or visually impaired, we're going to talk a little bit about some tips that would help make your year more successful for the students in your class who are blind or visually impaired, the sighted peers, and for all the adults in your class as well. The first thing I want to talk to you about is high standards. Children who are blind or visually impaired can pretty much do anything that their sighted counterparts can do, and it's important to have high expectations for them so that they can live up to these high expectations. You might have to accommodate their needs by providing things tactily or with appropriate visual accommodations, but they should be able to do everything that their sighted peers can do. When we treat them equally as their peers, we're going to have them develop a sense of self-esteem and confidence that they wouldn't develop if we were to, always do things for them. You're going to need to work closely, probably with the teacher for the visually impaired or TVI and other service providers and paraprofessionals, and they can give you tips that are specific to your student. But from talking to parents of children with visual impairments and other professionals in the field, the most important thing that we can take away as classroom teachers is that we need to expect the same quality of work and the same workload from our students who are blind and visually impaired as their sighted peers. Really, aside from having high standards, the second most important thing from my perspective is to know that accessibility is really the most important thing that you need to worry about in your classroom. The visual impairment really is just an impairment in sight, right? So as long as we can accommodate for that lack of sight or reduced visual acuity or reduced visual fields and provide things in an appropriate format, they're going to be able to do everything. So you have to make sure as a classroom teacher that you're really following that IEP, that you understand the accommodations to make things visually appropriate for your students, and that you understand the work that goes into creating these materials. Depending on your school system, the classroom teacher might be responsible for creating accessible documents, or there might be a paraprofessional that's in charge of that, or your TVI might be in charge of that. Sometimes school systems outsource Braille production and someone else is responsible for that. So understanding the timeline and the length of time needed to create these accessible materials is really important. For example, sometimes a worksheet that's been copied over several times and it needs to be produced in Braille, it might take 4 or 5 days to have that created in Braille. Unfortunately, a lot of Braille can't just be copied from a Word document and pasted into a program and then just printed out in Braille. It takes someone who's familiar with Braille and Braille formatting, a transcriptionist, to go through and clean it up and make the flow work really well and make sure that there aren't any typos. There are some special indicators that are required for Braille math, for example, that you can't just write numbers in there and it will come out perfectly. So if you're going to be teaching something, try to get materials to whoever is providing it in an accessible format at least a week in advance. I know that can be really tough as a classroom teacher, but I know that a lot of paraprofessionals I've worked with and that we have spent so many hours outside of the school day getting things accessible for our students, because really the law requires the student with a visual impairment to receive the appropriate materials at the same time as their sighted peer. So I understand that last minute things come up and you'll have to accommodate them in different ways, but trying to plan in advance and getting those materials to the student at the exact same time is really important, not just to follow the law, but to respect the visual needs of that student and to make sure that they're able to access the materials. It can be extremely complicated to learn just through auditory sense, and it's not fair. We wouldn't expect that of a sighted student, and we can't do that for a student with a visual impairment or who is blind. Kind of along those same lines, we can't just copy classwork onto 11 by 17 paper and assume that it's going to be appropriate. Sometimes that is appropriate, and sometimes that's the only option that we have to make something accessible for a student. But when we take something and we enlarge it 122%, or we take a worksheet that's been copied 3 or 4 or 5 times and then we blow it up on a copier, the font is going to probably get a little blurry. And when you're talking about someone with reduced acuities, that blurry font is going to be even more difficult to access. So it's really important to know what is best. Sometimes printing it out from the original document in a larger font is going to work. Sometimes providing it in a digital way will work better. So just planning with your TVI or your paraprofessional and service providers and collaborating with them. I like to plan in advance and have classroom teachers let me know what's going on, so that if I know something's going to be tricky, or we might have to order materials from somewhere else to provide them at the same time or in a tactile way, that might be a little different, so that I can plan in advance for that. It's really great as a TVI. We've kind of talked a lot about everything that's on this page. So one more little tip from this page is try not to ask the student if he or she can see things. A person who is blind or visually impaired doesn't always know what they can and can't see. It can be, they might see part of it, or they might think they see part of it and they may not. So the answer almost always to that question is going to be yes. So instead of asking if a student can see things, if you need to verify, you can just ask them what they see, and you're going to learn a lot more from them about what they're able to see on the page or the board or whatever you're talking about, rather than just saying, can you see? There are a lot of ways that you can foster respect in your classroom that sometimes aren't always apparent. As a TVI, I always use names with my student, and that's going to be when I'm entering a room or when I'm talking to the student. If I haven't already been talking to them, I always say, "Hi, so-and-so, my name is Miss Amanda," or "Hey, student, it's Miss Amanda, how are you today?" Just to let them know that it's me. I know most of my students can recognize my voice and hear me coming from a mile away, or they might notice by the way I'm walking or the way I place my bag down that it's me. But in order to foster that respect, always try to tell them who you are when you're about to talk to them. When you're talking to other people in the classroom, talk to them by name instead of calling on people based on, you know, their number or where they are in the classroom, or just saying, okay, you. Just say, okay, Daniel, you can answer that question. When an adult comes into the classroom, just say, hey, Mr. Joe is here, to let that student know who's there. And try not to do a guessing game. It's the most disrespectful thing that someone can do, to be, hey student, guess who I am? And if you have an adult that does that, because so many people do it, because I think they think that it's amazing how well our students can auditorily discriminate voices. I see it so much in the field. A teacher or a substitute might come up and say, hey student, guess who it is? And my student is probably working on something and shouldn't be disturbed anyway, but then they have to rack their brains trying to figure out who of the thousands of people they've ever met in their entire lives could this person that they don't really know that well be. So discourage it, stop it if you see it happening, and try to always make sure you're using names yourself when you're working in the classroom environment. Along those same lines of thinking, when you're talking to your class and doing large group instruction and small group instruction, try to be mindful of using vague terminology and try not to use it. I know that when we're up talking in front of a class and we're explaining where students are supposed to put their work when they're done working in like a turn-in folder, a lot of times teachers will stand up and say, okay, well, here's where you're going to put your work in this folder when you're done, and then you're going to come over here and you're going to get your Chromebook so that you can start working. Your student who is blind or visually impaired might have a general idea of where you are in the room when you're talking about that, but they're not going to be able to follow that direction independently. And so they're going to need help from you in order to fulfill those tasks. And that's really restrictive to them, and it's not fostering a level of independence. So instead, if you say, there's a blue bin on the counter by the sink where you're going to put your work when you're done, and then I want you to go over to the right of my closet where you're going to find the Chromebook cart, and that's where we're going to keep the Chromebooks. And then allow that student to come up and see and feel what you're talking about, so they can experience that. And then when everyone else in the class is doing it independently, your student will be able to do it independently as well. It's going to be a lot less hassle for you in the long run if you can get used to using purposeful, clear directions and using positional terms in the classroom. Another way to foster respect in the classroom is to be mindful of seating and positioning. Sometimes students who have low vision can see a little bit out of one of their eyes, and you want to make sure that that eye has optimal viewing. Sometimes our students might have field losses and can only see maybe out of the left side of their right eye, and you need to be mindful of what that looks like. So ask your TVI and try to respect that at all times. I usually encourage my students to speak up for themselves if they're sitting in a position where they don't have optimal viewing. So come up with a plan with your TVI to make sure that seating and positioning in the classroom is appropriate for your student. A lot of times students with low vision and who are blind have orientation and mobility skills or services. And a lot of times people think of that as using a cane, and that is a big part of orientation mobility, but there's more to that. And learning sighted guide or human guide from your orientation mobility specialist is going to be really important for students in emergency situations and fire drills. And having the students in your class be familiar with sighted and human guide is going to really be important too. We don't want to be leading our children with visual impairments around by holding their hands and kind of dragging them around. We don't want to be putting our hands on their bodies and moving them within the classroom environment. Those are kind of disrespectful ways of interacting with people who have visual impairments. Instead, the person with the visual impairment can be more proactive in navigation around their environments by using human guide, which is the same as sighted guide, by holding, if they're little kids, they'll hold fingers or wrists, but they're holding you, you're not holding them, or holding your arm in a specific way. So in the bottom of this video on YouTube, I'm going to post links to some guides for how to do sighted and human guide. But feel free to ask your TVI. They should be knowledgeable in human and sighted guide. And if they're not, ask the orientation mobility specialist. These are ways that other kids in the class can lead or guide someone within an environment. And it's really great, especially in like fire drills, for getting out quickly and safely if that person's not able to do so just using the cane or another way of traveling. So following those rules are going to be really great in the classroom. You know, as a TVI, I always joke around that my job is to work myself out of a job. And in order to do that, I want to foster independence from my students. And that can be really, really difficult. So I wanted to share 19 ways to step back. It's up on the NFB website, the National Federation for the Blind, and it's really more for, I think, vision teachers and paraprofessionals and probably parents who work with students, but some of these are really good for classroom teachers too, so I just kind of wanted to share them with you, and I highlighted those in yellow. You can always pause the video and read all of them if you'd like, but again, with having high expectations and standards and allowing our students with visual impairments to work through their problems, we're going to create less work for ourselves, really, and we're going to help them be independent citizens in the long run. So just going to read through a couple of them. Know that it's okay that our students are going to have to work through things, and sometimes it might take a little bit longer. Maybe pause before you answer or help. Sometimes a lot of what I do looks like I'm just sitting there, but I'm really waiting for my students to work through things and figure out the processes themselves. So a tip for that might be to sit on your hands while you're doing something and give them verbal prompts instead of touching them. A lot of parents of children who are blind or visually impaired will say that people touch their children way more than they need to, and you'll hear blind individuals say that in adulthood either or when they're old enough to express that. So try not to touch so much. To continue along with this kind of theme, really the only impairment associated with vision loss is from lack of information. So if we're providing things in an accessible format for them, they're going to be fine. Just know that they're capable of, as long as there's not a dual disability or something else going on, that might impact that you need to accommodate for, that people with visual impairment can do whatever their sighted peers are able to do as well. Call on students to be learning partners or sighted guides instead of doing it as an adult. It's going to help create a world really of empathic people who are able to interact with people who are blind if the students take on that sort of role for each other and allow the blind student to lead things as well. But just instead of having an adult always be a learning partner or a sighted guide, have your students in your classroom do that as well. You can expect or teach the student with a visual impairment to ask classmates for information instead of always asking the paraprofessional or the teacher like what page they're on or what's for lunch, or all those things. They can rely on peers, just like we kind of tell students, especially in early elementary school, to ask a buddy before you come ask a teacher. Same thing for students who are blind or visually impaired. Remind yourself that you're stepping back so the students can be independent. I know that it's sometimes faster to do it ourselves for the students, but really we're being detrimental to that student in the long run by doing things for them. And every time we do something for that individual, we're hurting them. So just think of it like that. Like you are helping your students by allowing them to do for themselves. Sometimes waiting can be extremely difficult. I am someone who I can wait out anybody, but I know other people can sometimes really struggle with that. So if you're waiting for a student who's blind or visually impaired to complete a task, time them. And a lot of times you'll see that what felt like 15 minutes was really only 4, and it's actually not that bad at all. It can be really important to tell other adults who come into the classroom, if you have a college student who's volunteering, or a mother or a father volunteering in your classroom, just let them know what's going on so that they can also work on fostering this level of independence. Let's see what else. I like for classroom teachers to be the contact point for my student when they're working with something. I will kind of help facilitate the student taking a level of independence with these sorts of questions and owning up to their needs and advocating for their own needs. But the classroom teacher really should be the person who is the contact point for the student for asking for help or asking for accessible materials or alerting you if something's not appropriate or if they need some extra help with something, to kind of like taking an ownership for the student as their classroom teacher. It's okay if your student makes mistakes and gets into trouble. It's part of the human experience. Sometimes I will let students do little bumps into something if they're not using their cane correctly, or if your student accidentally leads the wrong direction. Instead of always intervening, allow them to make some mistakes and problem solve and figure out how to get out of their mistakes so that they can do that later on when there's not an adult there. And the last tip from this is one of my favorites, and it's to post a sign in your classroom saying, "Could I be doing less?" And I really think that's a wonderful tip to have for all of our students, because as adults, it's so easy to do things for children, and it can be really hard to just allow children to live life and make mistakes and learn and grow. I hope you found this video helpful and that it can open some topics of conversation between you and your TVI this year, and can really help you foster a classroom environment that is accessible for all students and fosters an environment for independence. And I'm so optimistic that you're going to have a great year, and I just hope it goes that way. Thank you for watching my video.